Before we begin, make sure you subscribe and hit the like button so you never miss the cases that shape America's darkest history. Tonight's story isn't just a crime, it's a ghost that returned after 40 years, and the truth behind it will change everything you think you know about unsolved murder. There are stories in American crime that refuse to stay buried, stories that linger like cold breath on the back of your neck, resurfacing every time a new discovery threatens to tear open an old wound. The tale of the Golden State Killer is one of those shadows, a predator who vanished into the everyday world so completely that he became a myth. For decades, survivors, detectives, and entire communities lived with the echo of his crimes, unsure if the man who had shattered their lives was dead, hiding, or still watching from somewhere just out of sight. His legacy was a chilling reminder that not every monster lives in the dark. Sometimes, he lives right next door. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer drifted through history as a ghost with many names. In one city, he was the Visalia ransacker. In another, the East Area rapist. Farther south, he became the original Night Stalker. Each identity was a mask he crafted through fear, violence, and precision. What terrified investigators most was not just the brutality of his attacks, but the realization that the man behind these crimes understood the system better than they did. He had training, he had insight, he had discipline, and he used all of it to slip through the cracks of American law enforcement like smoke. What haunted the nation was the method, the chilling patience of a predator who stalked his victims for weeks before striking. He studied their routines, watched them sleep, moved through their homes long before they ever knew they were being hunted. Survivors recalled the eerie sense that someone had been inside their walls without their knowledge. Weapons mysteriously unloaded, windows quietly unlatched, small objects displaced just enough to go unnoticed. These details painted the portrait of a criminal whose cruelty was matched only by his meticulousness, turning ordinary neighborhoods into psychological prisons. As the years passed and the attacks ceased, the ghostly legend of the Golden State Killer grew. True crime writers dissected his patterns, documentaries speculated about his identity, and armchair detectives tried to connect the countless fragments of his crimes. But the truth remained maddeningly out of reach. Every new theory felt too small, every possibility too thin. With each passing decade, the fear that he would never be caught settled deeper into the American consciousness, transforming the case into one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in U.S. history. But time, as it always does, reshaped the battlefield. The arrival of advanced DNA technology awakened hope in a case long considered impossible to solve. Biological evidence collected in the 1970s, once just another cold file, now held the potential to expose a truth hidden for generations. When investigators realized they could use genetic genealogy to trace unknown suspects through distant relatives, the nation watched a miracle unfold. A ghost that once drifted freely through police blind spots was suddenly trapped inside strands of code he had left behind decades earlier. The breakthrough moved faster than anyone expected. Public genealogy databases, family trees, and long-forgotten relatives became the key to unlocking the identity of a man who once seemed unstoppable. As detectives narrowed the field from hundreds to dozens to one, the world felt the tremor of history bending. The arrest of a quiet, elderly man in Sacramento stunned America, not because he seemed dangerous, but because he didn't. He looked ordinary, unremarkable, a man who blended into the quiet rhythm of suburban life, and yet, behind those aging eyes lived the ghost that had haunted California for decades. His unmasking shattered the illusion that time heals all wounds. Instead, it proved something far more chilling. The darkness we fear most can outlive memory, outlive headlines, outlive entire generations, until science drags it screaming into the light. This is how the Golden State Killer returned from the shadows, not by striking again, but by being hunted by a new kind of weapon, the truth hidden in his own DNA. Across the sprawling map of California, the same shadow appeared under different names, drifting from city to city like a storm no one could outrun. Each community thought it was facing a new threat, a different intruder, a separate nightmare. They didn't yet know they were all looking at the same face. One man who reinvented himself every time he crossed a county line. He became the Visalia ransacker in one town, terrorizing homes with a mix of petty theft and eerie precision. In another, he morphed into the East Area rapist, a far more violent predator whose attacks shattered the sense of safety in middle-class neighborhoods. Farther south, he evolved again, earning the name the original Night Stalker as he escalated from terror to murder. Each label was a chapter in a horrifying evolution, but the public didn't realize they belonged to the same book. The fragmentation of his identity wasn't an accident. It was one of his greatest weapons. Investigators in the 1970s didn't have the communication networks, cross-jurisdiction systems, or shared databases that law enforcement relies on today. Crimes occurring hundreds of miles apart seemed unrelated, even when they carried the unmistakable fingerprints of the same twisted mind. As headlines erupted under different names, the truth hid in plain sight. The Golden State was being hunted not by many criminals, but by one who understood how to manipulate geography, bureaucracy, and fear itself. Every nickname he earned represented a city traumatized, a police force overwhelmed, and a community stripped of its innocence. Residents locked their doors earlier, bought guard dogs, installed floodlights, and slept with weapons nearby, but none of it mattered. Each alias signaled a new wave of panic, a new set of victims forced to navigate the unthinkable reality of being stalked by someone who seemed to appear and disappear at will. The newspapers could only describe what they saw: a phantom who broke into homes, tied couples together, whispered threats in the dark, and vanished moments before officers arrived. And as each region gave him a name, they unwittingly created a legend he could hide behind. What made his multiplicity so terrifying was the realization that he wasn't just changing locations, he was changing forms. The ransacker, known mostly for burglaries, suddenly became a rapist. The rapist evolved into a killer. The killer became a ghost. This shifting persona revealed a disturbing truth. He was studying not only his victims but also law enforcement itself. With every move, he tested boundaries, pushed patterns, and learned how to dismantle the barriers that were meant to protect the public. His many identities weren't disguises. They were stepping stones toward darker ambitions. For investigators, the scattered aliases created blind spots that lasted decades. Detectives working the Visalia burglaries had no idea they were chasing the same suspect being hunted for sexual attacks near Sacramento. Police in Santa Barbara didn't know their murderer was the same man committing home invasions hundreds of miles away. Each agency built its own profile, collected its own evidence, and crafted its own timeline, never suspecting they were chasing the same ghost, growing stronger with every reinvention. The confusion was so deep that even after early DNA testing linked crimes together, it took years before the nation understood the full scope of what this man had done. Communities, meanwhile, were left with legends that felt too monstrous to be human. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Survivors carried the burden of trauma that no one else could understand. Entire neighborhoods were stained with memories of nights where footsteps echoed outside windows, phones rang with chilling silence, and locked doors became meaningless. Each alias wasn't just a name. It was a scar left on the Golden State itself, carved into cities that would remember those nights for generations. And yet the truth, once finally revealed, was more unsettling than any of the names he was given. Behind all those identities, behind all the masks, behind all the terror, there was only one man, ordinary, unnoticed, and indistinguishable from the millions of people who walked the same streets. A predator so adaptable that he fooled not just investigators, but time itself. A killer who hid behind his own mythology until science forced all his names to collapse into their true form: Joseph James DeAngelo. Long before the world learned his name, the man behind California's most haunting crimes wore a badge. He patrolled quiet neighborhoods, responded to domestic disputes, and blended effortlessly into the system designed to stop predators like him. This duality, protector by day, monster by night, became one of the most disturbing revelations when investigators finally uncovered his identity. It explained so much: his ability to disappear, his mastery of escape routes, and the way he stayed one step ahead of every agency that hunted him. He wasn't just familiar with police procedure. He had once followed it, enforced it, and used it as a blueprint for his own darkness. The knowledge he gained as a police officer gave him a level of precision that terrified detectives. He chose neighborhoods with strategic escape paths, creeks, trails, and open fields where he could vanish instantly. He knew how officers responded to calls, how far patrol units were from certain subdivisions, and how thinly stretched resources were at different hours of the night. Every crime scene showed evidence of planning far beyond the instincts of an average criminal. He wasn't improvising, he was executing operations. Victims later recalled sensing that their attacker knew things he shouldn't. He moved through homes like someone trained to clear rooms. He positioned himself in blind spots. He created barriers that slowed down pursuers. He manipulated the environment so that officers arriving moments too late found only the echo of his presence. None of this was accidental. His law enforcement background allowed him to reverse engineer every threat against him. He knew where evidence could be left behind, and he knew how to avoid leaving it. Each step he took was the opposite of chaotic. He was calculating, controlled, and frighteningly intentional. Even his choice of victims reflected a tactical mindset. Middle-class neighborhoods with predictable schedules, single-story homes with easy entry points, families living near routes that offered instant cover. He didn't simply attack. He mapped, studied, and rehearsed. Some investigators believed he performed dry runs, moving silently through yards and alleys to test the reliability of his future escape plans. His stalking wasn't an impulsive act of violence. It was surveillance, the kind an officer would conduct before a raid. But in this case, the raid was against innocent families who had no idea they were being watched. His understanding of police psychology made him even more dangerous. He anticipated the assumptions detectives would make, the patterns they would look for, and the mistakes they were likely to repeat. When one jurisdiction believed the criminal had moved on, he was already several steps ahead, shifting his territory before anyone could link the crimes. When task forces narrowed their efforts, he adjusted his methods to create confusion. He weaponized the very limitations of multi-agency cooperation in the 1970s and 80s, knowing that fractured communication would keep his identities separate and his trail cold. The most chilling part of his evolution was the ease with which he slipped out of the role of officer and into the role of predator. Colleagues described him as intense, temperamental, and unpredictable, but few imagined the horrors he was capable of. It wasn't just that he understood the system. He exploited it with a level of confidence that suggested he never once believed he would be caught. And for decades, he was right. Every escape, every vanished footprint, every misdirection was a reminder that the man terrorizing California wasn't fighting the police. He was outsmarting them with their own playbook. When investigators finally confronted the truth, that the Golden State Killer had once worn the uniform, they understood the magnitude of the betrayal. This wasn't just a criminal who exploited weaknesses in the system. This was a man who once vowed to uphold the law, who instead turned his training into a weapon against the very public he swore to protect. His story became not just one of horror, but of a chilling paradox. The perfect predator created by the very institution meant to stop him. Long before his attacks ever made the news, the terror began in silence. Weeks, sometimes months, before he struck, he was already inside the lives of his victims. He moved through neighborhoods like a phantom, taking note of who lived alone, who had children, whose lights went out at the same time every night. He memorized their routines with the patience of a hunter who knew his prey would never sense the trap tightening around them. While families felt safe in their own homes, he was already watching from the darkness, studying the small details that would later become the blueprint for their nightmares. What made him truly terrifying was the way he infiltrated a home before the victims even knew they were targets. Survivors later discovered that weapons kept for protection had been emptied of bullets. Windows they were sure they'd locked had been quietly unlatched, and small objects had been moved just slightly, tiny disturbances that only became meaningful in hindsight. These weren't random signs of intrusion. They were the marks of someone rehearsing, someone returning multiple times to ensure total control over the environment. He didn't break into homes to steal. He broke in to take ownership of them. His phone calls were another layer of psychological warfare. Victims recalled receiving strange late-night rings followed by silence or heavy breathing that vanished as soon as they answered. These weren't prank calls. They were reconnaissance. He was listening to their voices, confirming their schedules, testing their vulnerability. Every call was a signal that he was becoming more familiar with their lives than anyone could imagine. The chilling part was how normal everything seemed at the time, how easily his presence blended into the everyday rhythm of life until it was too late. When he finally decided to strike, he did so with unnerving calm. He moved through the house with an eerie confidence, like someone revisiting a place he'd been many times before. Victims often described the same ritual, the sudden shattering of safety, the beam of a flashlight slicing through the darkness, the whispered commands. He tied his victims with precision, often using shoelaces or bindings crafted from objects already inside the home. Everything he used belonged to them, as if he wanted the very walls around them to participate in the terror. If a man was present, the threat escalated. He would bind him, place dishes or glassware on his back, and whisper that if he heard them fall, even the slightest clatter, both the man and the woman would die. This tactic immobilized them completely, turning the simplest movement into a potential death sentence. While the man lay frozen, paralyzed by fear, the intruder took his time. He ransacked rooms, took valuables and odd personal items, and then committed atrocities that scarred entire communities. The true horror was not just the violence, it was the ease with which he made time stand still, trapping his victims in a living nightmare. Survivors often spoke of his composure, how nothing about him felt rushed or frantic. He didn't panic, he didn't stumble, he didn't make mistakes. Every action revealed preparation far beyond impulse or rage. He had studied their homes, tested entry points, practiced his escape routes, and learned exactly how long he could stay before police would arrive. His confidence came from knowledge, the kind only someone who had stalked, infiltrated, and mapped a home repeatedly could possess. He wasn't reacting to the environment. He had already mastered it. What made these attacks so unforgettable was the chilling realization that the terror began long before the crime itself. The Golden State Killer didn't invade spaces. He assimilated into them. He turned familiar surroundings into traps, transformed everyday objects into weapons, and made victims feel as if their entire world had been silently corrupted without warning. His preparation wasn't just a method. It was a psychological assault that made every creak, every shadow, every phone ring feel like a lingering echo of the night he chose to strike. In the beginning, his crimes looked like the work of a restless prowler, someone who slipped into homes to steal small items, unsettle families, and vanish without leaving a clear motive behind. The Visalia burglaries, as they would later be called, appeared almost chaotic on the surface. Drawers were rifled through, souvenirs were taken, rooms were left in eerie disarray. But detectives who studied the pattern saw something far more chilling emerging beneath the surface, a predator refining his technique. Every burglary was a rehearsal, a test of boundaries, a quiet study of how long he could stay, what residents reacted to, and how far he could push the fear without escalating too quickly. The transition from burglar to rapist didn't happen abruptly. It unfolded like a dark evolution. By the time he earned the name East Area Rapist, his methods had matured into something both organized and sadistic. He no longer entered homes simply to take objects. He entered to take control. The attacks became ritualistic, defined by preparation, psychological manipulation, and a chilling level of patience. Victims described the same patterns: the whispered threats, the endless commands, the deliberate silence that filled the room like a weight. What once seemed like random intrusions were now being understood as deliberate acts of dominance, carefully practiced during his earlier crimes. As the attacks multiplied, communities were forced to confront a horrifying truth: this man was escalating. Each time he re-emerged, he carried a deeper level of brutality. He pushed boundaries further, stayed inside homes longer, prolonged the terror with a precision that felt almost clinical. It became clear that he wasn't simply breaking laws, he was breaking people. Survivors spoke of the emotional scars that lingered long after the physical wounds healed, scars carved by a predator who viewed fear as a form of power, and he thrived on it. The shift to murder marked the final, irreversible stage of his transformation. Now known as the original Night Stalker in Southern California, he turned his violence toward couples who had once believed their homes were safe havens. His methods intensified. He struck with lethal force, left scenes drenched in terror, and vanished before neighbors even knew something was wrong. The escalation was so rapid, so deliberate, that investigators began to wonder if the years of stalking, breaking in, and assaulting had been preparing him for this level of devastation all along. The burglaries were no longer separate crimes. They were the opening act to something far darker. What made his evolution so disturbing was how natural it seemed for him. There was no hesitation, no visible shift in methodology, no clumsy transition from one crime type to another. His escalation was seamless, like someone following a path he had always intended to walk. Each stage built upon the last. The early robberies gave him confidence. The rapes gave him power. The murders gave him something even more intoxicating: the ability to erase witnesses forever. The consistency of his behavior revealed what investigators feared most. He wasn't driven by impulse. He was driven by progression. This trajectory left a trail of devastation across California, but it also left law enforcement grappling with a nightmare unlike anything they had seen. They weren't hunting a thief, a rapist, or a murderer. They were hunting all of them in a single man, someone who didn't fit a single profile because he embodied multiple predators at once, someone who had shaped himself through years of practice into one of the most complex and dangerous criminals in American history. His escalation wasn't just a pattern, it was a transformation that showcased just how meticulously he cultivated his own darkness. By the time his crimes ceased, he had completed his evolution from an unknown prowler to one of the most feared serial offenders in the United States. His ability to adapt, escalate, and refine his methods over time created a legacy so horrifying that even decades later, the mere mention of his names, any of them, still sends a cold ripple through the communities he terrorized. The monster had always been growing, and for years, no one realized it until it was far too late. For years, detectives believed the Golden State Killer had simply vanished, retreating into whatever darkness had birthed him. But as time passed and technology evolved, a different possibility began to emerge, one far more unsettling. It wasn't that he disappeared, it was that he stopped, because he realized his greatest weapon, anonymity, was slipping away. The arrival of forensic DNA testing in the late 1980s changed the rules of the hunt. Criminals who once hid behind jurisdictional gaps and lack of evidence suddenly faced a new kind of threat, science that could outlast them. And somewhere in California, the man who had terrorized the state understood before most criminals did that his window of freedom was closing. Investigators began to notice a chilling correlation. As DNA profiling became more reliable, his attacks abruptly ceased. It wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. He recognized that the world was changing, that law enforcement was about to gain a tool capable of unmasking him, no matter how much time passed. This awareness revealed something profound about his psyche. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't impulsive, and he wasn't driven solely by compulsion. He was calculating. He adapted to threats as quickly as he created them, and when the threat became too great, he simply melted into the ordinary life he had crafted as a shield. The sudden silence left communities confused. Had he died, moved away, been imprisoned under another name, or had he simply grown tired? But those who understood the patterns saw a truth harsher than any rumor. He had stopped because it was the only way to survive. His mastery of police procedure, his knowledge of forensic trends, his obsession with control, all of it led him to one conclusion. The world of crime was evolving faster than he could. DNA was a predator of its own, hunting him invisibly, waiting for a single mistake, and he refused to give it one. This wasn't a man who faded because his desires weakened. This was someone who calculated risk with precision. He had built an entire criminal empire on preparation, patience, and power. But DNA testing introduced an element he couldn't manipulate, an unchanging, undeniable signature he had left at nearly every crime scene. Biological evidence had never mattered before. Suddenly, it became the most dangerous thing in his world, a ticking clock he couldn't silence. So he disappeared not out of guilt, but out of self-preservation. The irony was devastating. For decades, survivors waited for closure, believing the man who tormented them might still be out there. Yet all that time, he continued living an unremarkable life, protected by the fact that he had stopped before technology caught him. He became a ghost with a heartbeat, a man who watched advancements in crime solving with the same interest a fugitive watches news about his own case. Each new development, each breakthrough, each televised report on DNA profiling was another reminder that the world was inching closer to exposing what he had worked so hard to bury. By the early 2000s, cold case units across the country were revisiting unsolved crimes with renewed purpose. DNA evidence was being entered into national databases, matching cases once believed unrelated. The Golden State Killer's crimes were among them. Investigators realized that several of California's most notorious unsolved rapes and murders shared the same genetic signature. The ghost finally had a biological footprint linking every one of his identities together. But even then, the world didn't know his name, just that he existed somewhere, aging quietly, confident he had outsmarted everyone. What he didn't anticipate was that DNA would evolve again, expanding beyond criminals and into the everyday lives of millions of people. Genealogy kits, family trees, consumer databases. A new world was forming, one where a killer no longer needed to leave fresh evidence to be found. His past, preserved in the molecules he left behind decades earlier, was enough to corner him. The silence he believed would protect him became the very thing that sealed his fate. He thought he had outrun time. Instead, time was patiently waiting to turn his own biology against him. No detective, no informant, and no last-minute confession brought the Golden State Killer into the light. It was something far more unexpected, something no criminal from the 1970s could have imagined. The breakthrough came from a world built decades after his crimes ended, a digital universe where millions of people voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry, their heritage, their distant roots. What he never foresaw was that these ordinary people, searching for family history, would unknowingly become the key to unmasking one of the most elusive predators in American history. The chain that would one day lead to his arrest began not with evidence he left behind, but with the genetic fingerprints of people who had never even met him. Investigators used a public genealogy database to upload the killer's crime scene DNA, not to find him directly, but to identify distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, branches on a family tree that stretched across generations. From those strands of possibility, they built a map, a complex, sprawling web of connections, births, deaths, marriages, and migrations. Piece by piece, they narrowed the possibilities until the number of potential suspects shrank from hundreds to dozens, from dozens to a handful, and finally, to one man who matched the age, location, and profile of the ghost they had hunted for 40 years. It was science meeting persistence, biology meeting justice. What made this breakthrough astonishing was the simplicity of its logic. Every human carries a story in their DNA, a story that connects them to those who came before. The Golden State Killer believed he had erased his past by stopping his crimes before DNA testing could catch him. But he never considered that relatives he had never met would one day voluntarily upload parts of their genome onto the internet. Their blood carried echoes of his, and those echoes became a beacon that investigators followed straight to his doorstep. He didn't leave new evidence. His family tree turned against him. When detectives finally built the genetic profile that pointed to Joseph James DeAngelo, they approached with the meticulous caution his crimes demanded. They followed him, collected items he discarded, tissue, garbage, objects he touched, and confirmed that the DNA from the crime scenes matched the DNA of the quiet, aging man living in Sacramento. The realization hit with the force of revelation. The monster who once outran entire police departments had been hiding behind a suburban facade, mowing his lawn, shopping at local stores, living the life of a man who believed he was untouchable. But the world he outsmarted in the 1970s was gone. A new world had risen around him, and in that world, his genetic footprint was inescapable. The arrest sent shockwaves through the country. People were stunned, not just by the identity of the killer, but by the method that exposed him. It was a moment that redefined modern crime solving, proving that even cases so cold they felt frozen in time could suddenly ignite with new life. Survivors who had spent decades waiting for justice received the news with a mixture of disbelief and relief. For the first time in their lives, the name behind the nightmare had a face, an address, a history. The ghost was no longer just a legend whispered in fear. He was a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Genealogy had become the bridge between past and present, a tool that reached backward through generations to illuminate the truth. It wasn't just a scientific breakthrough. It was a shift in the balance of power. For the first time, time itself favored the victims. What had once been his greatest weapon, decades of silence, became meaningless against the permanency of DNA. His crimes could age, his victims could age, but the evidence encoded in his cells remained unchanged, waiting patiently for technology to catch up. And in that moment, the Golden State Killer became the first major test case for a new era, one where criminals could no longer rely on the limitations of the past to protect them. His unmasking was more than justice for his victims. It was a message to every predator who believed time was on their side. The world had changed. The future had arrived. And in this new reality, even the oldest ghosts could be hunted down by the quiet, unyielding truth written in their genes. When news broke that the Golden State Killer had finally been identified, the shock wasn't just that he was alive, it was who he had been all along. Joseph James DeAngelo, a man who once wore a badge and swore to uphold the law, had been living an ordinary suburban life, hidden behind the very image of normalcy he had weaponized decades earlier. Neighbors described him as quiet, private, occasionally irritable, but never dangerous. To them, he was just another aging man who walked his driveway each morning. who argued about barking dogs, who blended so seamlessly into the landscape that no one ever suspected the darkness buried in his past. The contrast was almost unbelievable. A man capable of unspeakable cruelty, living with the routine predictability of a retired grandfather. His arrest created a rupture between the man people thought they knew and the monster investigators had chased for decades. As details emerged, the nation struggled to reconcile the horrifying acts of the original Night Stalker with the image of an elderly man being led out of his home in handcuffs. He didn't look like a predator. He didn't look like a serial rapist. He didn't look like a killer. But that, investigators later realized, had been his greatest camouflage. He built his life around the illusion of normalcy, relying on the belief that no one would dig deep enough to uncover the truth. And for decades, that strategy worked flawlessly. What disturbed many was the revelation that his law enforcement background wasn't just a footnote. It was central to his evolution as a criminal. Former colleagues recalled flashes of temper, obsessive behavior, and an almost obsessive need for control, but nothing that hinted at the horrors he was committing at night. In retrospect, the signs were there, hidden beneath layers of discipline and authority. The man who once wrote parking citations and investigated burglaries had secretly been orchestrating some of California's most terrifying crimes. The betrayal was not just personal, it was systemic. The protector had been the predator all along. As investigators pieced together his life after the crimes stopped, an unsettling picture emerged. DeAngelo had built a rigid routine, going to work, raising a family, maintaining a stable household, all while carrying the weight of atrocities no one around him ever suspected. He lived among people who trusted him, worked with officers who believed he was one of them, and aged into a figure who seemed harmless on the surface. Yet for survivors, and the families of victims, this revelation reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The man responsible for decades of terror had aged peacefully, uninterrupted, while they carried the trauma of memories he never paid for. The arrest forced the nation to confront uncomfortable questions. How many predators hide behind professional respectability? How many criminals bury themselves in normal routines to escape suspicion? And how did someone capable of such brutality maintain a facade convincing enough to fool an entire state? The answers revealed something chilling about human nature. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the neighbor who waves from across the street, the coworker who keeps to himself, the man who blends so perfectly into the crowd that no one thinks to look twice. In court, he spoke almost nothing. His silence became another layer of cruelty. No apologies, no explanations, no acknowledgement of the devastation he caused. For many, it confirmed what they had always believed, that he had spent his entire life refusing to give anyone else control. Even when confronted with the total collapse of his freedom, he clung to the one power he still had, the power to withhold his voice. To victims who waited decades for answers, his silence felt like a final insult, a reminder of the void he had created in so many lives. Yet his silence only amplified the truth that finally emerged. The man who once hid behind multiple aliases, multiple jurisdictions, and multiple identities was now exposed under a single name. The badge he once wore no longer protected him. The suburban life he built could no longer hide him. The act was over, and the world finally saw him not as the quiet neighbor or the former officer, but as the figure who had haunted California for decades. The unmasking of Joseph James DeAngelo became a moment of collective reckoning, not just for the victims, but for a nation forced to confront the disturbing reality of what a predator can truly look like. When the Golden State Killer was finally unmasked through the power of genetic genealogy, a new question began echoing across America. If this ghost from the 1970s could be brought into the light, what other shadows might finally be forced out of hiding? For decades, the Zodiac Killer had occupied a space somewhere between legend and unanswered nightmare, a figure who taunted investigators, mocked the press, and left behind a trail of ciphers and bodies that remained unsolved long after the case went cold. His identity became one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history, a puzzle that resisted generations of detectives, codebreakers, and amateur sleuths. But the arrest of Joseph DeAngelo shifted that atmosphere. Suddenly, a new kind of hope began to rise. Perhaps the past wasn't as impenetrable as it once seemed. Investigators who had spent years studying the Zodiac's crimes began revisiting old evidence with renewed urgency. Letters he licked, envelopes he sealed, items he touched. For decades, The DNA collected from those artifacts had remained too degraded, too incomplete, or too inconclusive to build a case around. But the breakthrough that captured the Golden State Killer changed the equation. It wasn't just about matching DNA to a suspect anymore. It was about matching DNA to their relatives. Even a partial profile, once considered useless, could become a thread, leading to a family tree that narrowed itself with each generation. The methods once seen as science fiction were now part of everyday criminal investigation. For the public, the possibility of solving the Zodiac case felt almost surreal. Generations had grown up with the mystery, passing theories through documentaries, books, internet forums, and late-night debates. For many, the Zodiac wasn't simply a killer. He was a myth, a challenge, a symbol of a puzzle the world couldn't crack. But if genealogy could expose someone as careful and calculating as the Golden State Killer, then perhaps the Zodiac's arrogance, the very trait that made him so iconic, would become the flaw that ultimately brought him down. The idea that one of America's most taunting criminals could be undone by his own saliva felt both poetic and inevitable. Former investigators, journalists, and profiling experts began speaking publicly about the new potential. Some believed that the Zodiac's letters, stored for decades in sealed evidence bags, still held microscopic fragments capable of revealing a biological truth. Others warned that DNA might not be enough, that contamination, age, and environmental damage could render the evidence useless. Yet even the skeptics acknowledged that the game had changed. The Golden State Killer case proved that patience and technology could team up to defeat even the most careful criminals. And if it happened once, it could happen again. For families of Zodiac victims, the renewed hope brought a complex mix of emotions: relief, fear, anticipation, and the haunting possibility of closure after half a century of unanswered questions. Many had built their lives around a silence that never fully healed. Some had lost parents, siblings, or children to a killer who seemed to vanish without consequence. To imagine that the same science that exposed Joseph DeAngelo could now expose the Zodiac was both exhilarating and terrifying. Closure, after so long, can feel like reopening a wound before it heals. Online, the conversation became electric. Amateur sleuths analyzed the new methods. Digital detectives mapped out potential family trees, and forums once dominated by speculation now buzzed with scientific optimism. It wasn't just about curiosity. It was about the thrill of believing that history might be rewritten in real time, that a ghost who had taunted the world with coded messages might finally be forced to answer with something he could never manipulate: his DNA. The mythology surrounding the Zodiac began to shift from legend to possibility. But the most profound change came from within law enforcement itself. The arrest of the Golden State Killer proved that the gap between the past and the present had closed. Decades-old crimes were no longer untouchable, no longer protected by the limitations of their era. Technology had given investigators a bridge to the ghosts of the 20th century, and on the other side of that bridge, waiting silently in the dark, was the Zodiac. The man who once believed he was untouchable might soon face the same fate Joseph DeAngelo did: a life defined not by mystery, but by exposure. When news spread that the Golden State Killer had been identified through genetic genealogy, America found itself split between awe and unease. On one side were those who saw the breakthrough as a triumph of science, a long-awaited victory for victims whose cases had gone cold before DNA technology even existed. On the other side were those who felt a quiet chill run down their spine. If a killer could be exposed not through his own DNA, but through the DNA of distant relatives who had never met him, what did that mean for the future of privacy? What boundaries had been crossed? The debate didn't weaken the significance of his capture. It amplified the weight of the question: how far is too far when pursuing justice? The ethical concerns were impossible to ignore. Millions of Americans had uploaded their genetic information to genealogy services in search of answers about their ancestry, never expecting that their DNA could one day help solve a murder case. They hadn't consented to be part of criminal investigations. Yet, without their genetic fingerprints woven into distant branches of a shared family tree, one of the most brutal serial offenders in U.S. history might still be unknown. This tension between individual privacy and collective safety became one of the defining conversations of the decade. Justice had been served, but it came with a shadow many couldn't shake. Law enforcement agencies, meanwhile, saw a new frontier opening before them. For decades, unsolved murders had haunted cold case units across the country. Crimes with no suspects, no leads, and no remaining witnesses. Now, suddenly, there was a tool that could reach past all of those limitations. Genetic genealogy didn't just look for a match. It traced lineage, history, and bloodlines in a way traditional policing never could. Cases once believed to be unsolvable began flickering back to life. But with this new power came an equally powerful responsibility, one that forced investigators to consider how far they were willing and allowed to go. Families of victims saw the issue through a different lens. To them, the idea that offenders could finally be exposed after decades of silence felt like a breakthrough worth embracing, regardless of how it came about. They had lived in the shadow of unanswered questions, hoping for closure that always seemed just out of reach. For many, the ethical debate paled in comparison to the relief of knowing that someone, anyone, would finally be held accountable. In their eyes, the moral cost had already been paid by the victims long ago. If science offered a path to truth, it was a path worth taking, but others warned of a slippery slope. If genealogy could be used to identify killers, what else could it be used for? Could it become a shortcut for surveillance? Could innocent people become targets simply because they shared the wrong genetic markers? The Golden State Killer case forced the country to confront questions it had never asked before. Questions about identity, privacy, and how much of ourselves we unknowingly give away in the digital age. It was a reminder that every technological breakthrough carries unforeseen consequences, some groundbreaking, some unsettling. As the debate grew louder, one undeniable truth emerged. The world had changed forever. Criminals who once hid behind time, distance, or the decay of physical evidence could no longer rely on those shields. The past was no longer a safe hiding place. Genealogy had turned every bloodline into a potential witness, every family tree into a roadmap that could lead straight to a killer's door. Whether seen as a threat or a triumph, the power of genetic identification had transformed the landscape of crime solving in ways that could never be undone. And so, the Golden State Killer became more than a case. He became a symbol of a new era. His capture represented the collision between justice and technology, between privacy and responsibility, between the world we were and the world we are becoming. His unmasking forced America to confront a simple, haunting question. In the pursuit of monsters, how much of ourselves are we willing to reveal? It's a question that has no easy answer, but one that will define the future of forensic science and the future of every cold case still waiting in the dark.